Today we're taking a closer look at Uruguay and the School of the South. We briefly touched on this in our lecture on Eladio Dieste and his emphasis on the grid and brick form. Today we're going to dive further into the lead up and the impact of the School of the South in terms of the avant-garde in Uruguay. So we return to Torres Garcia. His body of work is so impressive. Not only the art and visual culture that he created, but this guy wrote over 500 articles in his lifetime. He was an unceasing teacher. He gave lectures left and right, and not only on his work as a painter, sculptural artist, and muralist. He was a novelist, a theorist, and as we discussed, his drive in life was to resolve complex dichotomies. For example, is ancient culture better than modern culture? Is it richer? Does it have more to it? This was something people fought about in cafes and universities. Questions like, is classicism more valuable than innovation? Should we focus on reason over emotional ways of intuiting the world? And when it came to art, figurative, which means work with human, animal, noticeable, recognizable form, or abstraction? And people, of course, they took their sides. The abstract artists felt like figurative art was just old-fashioned and was honestly false. We'll get into why they could think that kind of work is false shortly. And on the other hand, figurative artists felt like abstraction is just nonsense. There's nothing going on here. It's shapes, colors, geometry. That's not art. Two different battling, warring sides and ideas. For Torres Garcia, he, as you know, as we mentioned before, felt that there was no contradiction. He saw no contradiction in these polar opposites. And he thought that it was in the power of art and the power of the artist that these two differences, these many polar opposites, could be reconciled. You've seen the image before, but take a few minutes with this now. What is it that we're looking at? We have South America seemingly turned on its head, right? It seems to be upside down from the way we usually see it on a map or on a globe. There's a ship. Very old school kind of ship, right? Like the pirate ships or the ships of the explorers, the navigators, as well as the enslavers. We have this cross that marks where Uruguay is in reference to the map, the entire map of South America. We have the line of the equator. We have at the top, Polo Sur, or South Pole. And then we have some classic Torres Garcia elements, right? The sun and the moon, the fish, the land. At the bottom, the title, Escuela del Sur, or School of the South, which is a publication from the School of Torres Garcia in Montevideo, Uruguay. So what we're looking at is the front page of a magazine, a publication. In February of 1935, Torres Garcia published his first Latin American essay and manifesto, you guessed it, another manifesto, titled La Escuela del Sur, or the School of the South. Torres Garcia was 43 at this time. He had just returned to Montevideo, Uruguay, after spending quite a bit of time in Europe. He began his manifesto by saying this: our north is the south. There should be no north for us except in opposition to the south. So let us turn the map upside down and voila, That is our real position, not how the rest of the world sees it. He goes on to say, I have said school of the South, because in fact, our North is the South. What in the world? Okay, is he just changing directions on a map? What's happening? What's equivalent today that we could think about? What is he trying to convey? Here we are in North America. It may be hard to get into the mindset of thinking otherwise. He's not talking about just cardinal directions. What he's talking about is in terms of power, culture, prestige, impact. At the time of this manifesto, as we've discussed before, artists, thinkers, doctors, Latin Americans are going to Europe for school. They're going to what has long been seen as the center of culture, and has been seen like that, of course, since the period of colonization, when Spain came to the Americas and colonized, enslaved, and took over land and populations. Torres Garcia is saying, okay, that's enough. We're done with this. And the equivalent today would be the Black Lives Matter movement and white supremacist culture, right? Suddenly, and for some, not suddenly at all. For some, this has been visible, painfully visible for all too long. But this year we've hit a flashpoint, right? Where the things that we took for granted, perhaps absolutely wrongly, as like universal culture, we see instead that these are ideological positions. There's an assumption that white is the majority, that white just is, and that all other cultures, those are the things that stand out, which is so wrong-headed, right? So just like Torres Garcia is saying, this is enough. We are going to look to the South. We're going to look to ourselves as our guiding point, as our true north. It's a very similar movement of consciousness in terms of reorienting ourselves to say, actually, those things that we thought were just like every day, those are forms of white supremacy. It's that important, what he's saying. He represented this statement in this well-known image. Torres Garcia's perhaps his most famous image, which is the inverted map of South America that we see on the left. It announced the end of colonialism and the beginning of an autonomous art movement in Latin America. But not just an autonomous art movement, right? The idea was to free themselves from the bonds of European colonialism, to express themselves and who they were, who they are, without that heavy-handed colonial influence. We know about Torres Garcia, we know his focus on classicism, he loves antiquity, and in this statement, in this pronouncement, in this work, he is trying to highlight the ways that the art of antiquity, which many often immediately think of as Greco-Roman, that's not the case, that there are classical ancient civilizations in Latin America, in South America in particular for him, that should be championed, that should be put first, that should be emblems of aspiration. And we've studied many of those cultures. Take a second with this quote. It's that last phrase, right? This is a necessary rectification so that now we know who we are. This is a line of demarcation, thus far and no further, right? It's so powerful. The map that we're seeing here was published for the first time in May of 1936 in a publication called The Circle and Square. It's a Spanish version of a journal that Torres Garcia had founded in Paris. Torres Garcia was one of the Latin Americans who had a real protagonist role in Europe during the avant-garde era. And the name of the journal, this Circle and the Square, was already an allusion to the aesthetic and ideological tendencies that were to form the body of Torres Garcia's work. This act of inverting the map, of visualizing the South as the North, attempted to make Uruguayans and Latin Americans in general conscious of their own culture, stressing a sense of cultural identity as opposed to national identity, which was really a theme in the world at this time. You're going to watch a video in a few minutes about nationalism just to see how deep-seated it was that people were finding who they were in this idea of the nation. But Torres Garcia is saying, no, cultural identity and national identity. Cultural identity and national identity are not the same. What does that mean? How would we think of it today, for example? So, with this declaration, Torres Garcia founds what's called the School of the South. It's a school for artists, painters, thinkers, philosophers, writers, and it's based on a concept called constructive universalism, which address issues of cultural identity by paradoxically looking to the past in order to be modern. It's a way of proposing that the first peoples of the Andean regions are the point of origin for a new hemispheric modernism. We've seen something like this in the Mexican muralists. We've seen something like this in Brazil. This new particular format that emerges in Uruguay is something all its own.